assume if you ask for something, you're going to get a yes. Because if you just start from there, you can start thinking about, what you should be asking for, whether you should be asking for more, as we talked about earlier, whether you shouldn't be asking for this at all, whether you should be asking for this in a different way, right? Giving someone the ability to say no to you. And I think just that idea that, like, when you ask for things, people's default is to agree to you, right? Not to disagree. That's sort of the fundamental takeaway because that's true in all sorts of other contexts as well. Like when you make a point, people are trying to understand your point. They're not trying to jump down your throat the way we tend to expect. People, when they meet you, they like you more than you tend to think, right? They want to like you. So just this general idea of like people's default is to agree, is to cooperate, is to be influenced by you, I think is a really helpful way to sort of go through the world. And it means that we won't be scared to use our influence and ask for things, but at the same time, it means that we'll strike the right tone. We won't try to push people harder than we need to because we assume like this message will be received.
Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Now, Vanessa, I have to say that your book, you have more influence than you think, made me really happy because I've discovered some psychological biases, and we're going to talk about them in this conversation. Psychological biases in terms of what we think when it comes to influencing other people, persuading them, and that can be good or bad, but in many cases it can be good. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you because your book made me really happy. Thanks for writing it.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot.
All right. Now, also, I wanted to. So you are a professor of organizational behavior, right?
Yes.
Just so you know, where I start university, I studied in Italy, but I did a master's degree in English with professors from the US. And one professor, I remember Professor John Scammahon from Ohio University, he taught a class called Organizational Behavior. And there, it's not an understatement if I say that that class changed my life. It definitely
Wow.
changed the way I see the world, the way I see things, mainly from a business perspective. So again, I just wanted to highlight the value of your subject, of your area of expertise.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'd be curious what aspects of it were so life-changing.
For me, it was mainly about that. Up until that class, I was very interested in business in general, and I always wanted to be an entrepreneur, to run my own thing. But that class opened my eyes to what it means to do business while thinking about important values, important human
Mm.
values. And so it's hard for me now to get into the details, but for me, before the classes, it was mainly business, 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 money and profits. Whereas I've discovered that there's so much more to it than just the business side of things.
Hmm. Yeah, there's people there too.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And now in your book, Vanessa, you use an analogy which is Mr. Magoo to talk
Hmm.
about your the ideas in your book that we have more influence than we think. Now, for those who haven't read the book, for those who don't know Mr. Magoo, the analogy, could you please tell us that analogy?
Sure. So Mr. Magoo is this old cartoon character from something like the 1950s who really probably would not fly today because, there's a little bit of ableism in the depiction of Mr. Magoo. But basically, he is this older man who can't see very well, but he refuses to wear his glasses. And so he kind of walks through the world creating chaos because he doesn't see what he's doing. So, they come up with these very crazy farcical examples. Like, for example, he walks into something he thinks is a hotel bar, but it's actually like this rocket facility and, he starts messing around with things and like launches a rocket out into space, right? So, but basically he keeps wandering into these situations, thinking they're one thing, and not sort of paying attention to the way that he's just changed the whole dynamic in the room. Like this person is walking through who doesn't belong here, and they're, making a mess of things, and everything is being adjusted around this person essentially and being impacted by this person's presence in this strange situation. And so I open the book saying essentially that we've all got a little Mr. Magoo in us. We've all got a little bit of this tendency to sort of walk around the world and not realize the way we're impacting the events and the people around us. And, not in these necessarily these like extreme ways, although sometimes that's the case, but more these kind of little ways. We walk into a room and people notice that we're there and it changes the conversation, or, we engage in a behavior, even just like a behavior we would ordinarily do. And other people notice that and then they copy it and then someone else copies them and we kind of have these trickle effects. So it was really sort of just a a nice like metaphor for the ways in which we don't realize the influence we have all the time over other
Yeah.
people.
And I guess that's connected to those psychological biases that I've also discovered thanks to your book. Before we get there, now when I think about influence, persuasion, I think about a few books in particular that I've read. And one is, of course, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Also, Influence by Robert Cialdini. Also, in a way, connected to Sell is Human by Daniel Pink. We had Daniel on the podcast. Now, I'm just curious, from your perspective, what do you think? Where does your book fit within the existing literature, if you want?
Yeah, so I love this question because whenever I give a talk, I actually look up the Amazon ranking for Dale Carnegie's book, because people don't realize how old that book is. It was written in like 1936. It is so old. It's coming up on 100 years. And if you check the Amazon ranking, I think only once, and this is having checked it, like probably 100 times over the past number of years. Only once was it not in the top 100 of Amazon books. And, for anyone who has written a book, that's like a crazy position to maintain, let alone to maintain for almost 100 years. And so to me, those kinds of books, and, I love these books. I love How to Win Friends and Influence People. I love Daniel Pink's book. I love Bob Cialdini's book. They're great books, but they really are about how to gain influence, right? That's sort of the reason people buy those books is they feel like, I don't have enough influence. I want more of it. I want to learn how to persuade. I want to learn how to essentially make friends and influence people. And so it really comes from this sense of like, I'm not good at that thing, or I'm not as good at that thing as I would like to be. And so to me, I find it fascinating that people just, eat up those messages and just gravitate towards those messages to the point where, for almost 100 years, people are buying the same book at an exorbitant, rate. Because for me, I am a social psychologist and I did, my undergrad in psychology, my PhD in psychology. And one of the things you learn very early on in social psychology is just how much influence we have over other people. So we learn about these crazy effects where like, a small thing you say really impacts how people behave, or simply, you giving your opinion totally changes an opinion that someone else is willing to give, or just sitting in a room with someone and how you're acting or interpreting things, it just changes how other people do that as well. So you learn all these studies very early on about how much we impact other people. And that seems really inconsistent with this idea that, we need all these tools and tricks to be able to influence other people. And so my book was really trying to reconcile that. And my research over about the past 20 years has been kind of trying to reconcile that. But just sort of how can both these things be true? How can we have a ton of influence over other people and yet feel constantly like we need to learn how to have influence over other people. And so my book is really kind of making that point and showing people that actually you do have influence, even though you think that you don't. And also kind of getting at these psychological biases that lead us to miss the influence that we constantly have.
You mentioned psychological biases. So I'd love for you to explore some of them in a little bit more detail. One, for example, it's very much connected to what you've just said when you described the gist of your book is that often we underestimate how much influence we have over others. You say that people will do things for us more than we expect. Can we discuss this in a little bit more detail for those who haven't read the book?
Absolutely. So this is actually what my research has been on for about the past 20 years, this idea that we underestimate. So the book is we underestimate our influence in all these different ways, the things we say, the behaviors people mimic. But one of those ways, which is the most connected to my research, is we underestimate how likely it is that someone will agree to do something for us if we ask them to do it. And so this goes back to my early years as a graduate student, where we started running studies where we had people come into the lab and we had them guess how likely it would be that people would agree to do various favors for them. So we would say, we're going to have you go out into the world and ask strangers to fill out surveys, or ask strangers to loan you their cell phones, or ask strangers for a donation to charity. So we would say, we're going to have you do these things. How many people do you think you'll have to ask before you get, five people to agree to this? Or in some cases, it's to reach a certain fundraising goal. Then we would send them out into the world and they would actually ask people to do these things, and they would keep track of how many people agreed and how many people they had to ask. And we found again and again that people were twice as likely to agree to do these favors for people as people expected. And it was such a palpable kind of result. So in social psychology, lots of times you collect a bunch of data and then you're like, did my study work? Let's add up all the data and let's look at these tiny little averages and how they're different between conditions. And you don't really see it until you actually analyze the data. So the effects tend to be pretty small. In this case, when we started running these studies from the very get-go, it was palpable in the lab. So people would come in, we would say, we're going to have you ask people to do things. And immediately there would be this anxiety, and people would, you could sense it. They like really didn't want to do this. And then they would start asking questions like, well, what if nobody agrees? What if I can't do it in like the hour we had allotted to this study? And so they would clearly ask these questions that were like, I am not expecting this to be an easy task. Then we would send them out to go do this task, and they would come back much quicker than they expected, and they would practically bound back into the lab. They were like relieved and happy, and they would tell us immediately, like, I can't believe how easy that was. I can't believe that many people agreed. People are so nice. And that's not always the reason, as we kind of delve down, but that's at least their interpretation. And so it was the kind of effect that you could actually see, like you could see happen before we even entered the data. And then when we did enter the data, we found that indeed it was, people were twice as likely to do something if you ask for it directly than people expected.
Why is it, Vanessa, because you said, for example, that you had these people coming into your lab and then you would say, okay, now you're going to ask for these favors, for these things, and then they would say, oh, no way, this is going to be hard. Why is it that it's so hard to ask for things?
Yeah, it is really interesting, but people find it very uncomfortable. I'm sure this resonates with a lot of, the viewers and listeners, but people just find it very uncomfortable to ask for things. There's a number of reasons. So for one, we worry that it somehow reveals something about ourselves, something negative about ourselves. So in some cases, we don't ask for things because we think that people are going to think we're less competent. People are going to think, why couldn't you do that without me? Why could you do that on your own? That turns out to be a misconception. So there's research showing that, for example, if you ask someone for advice, you think like this person's going to judge me for not knowing the answer myself. But that person actually thinks you're really smart for going to them for advice, right? Because that person feels pretty good to be able to help you out. So there's this element of, I worry that people are going to judge me. But then there's also a concern about imposing on other people, right? You feel like I'm going to ask people and it's going to annoy them. They're going to be irritated. But in fact, that is also, in many cases, a misperception. So I'm sure we'll get into the ways in which, it's hard to say no. And that is part of what's going on. And in part, you are imposing on people. But at the same time, people are really good at sort of immediately reinterpreting their own behavior once they agree to do something as being like, oh, I'm a really nice person. I was given an opportunity to help this person out. And so, sort of the takeaway for both people is one person actually gets help when you ask someone for a favor, and the other person kind of walks away feeling like, oh, I got to help someone. I feel good about myself. I get this warm glow. We often talk about it in psychology. So again, there's this idea that like this is going to go worse when I ask someone for something than it actually winds up going.
Yeah, and you mentioned that not only is it hard to ask for things, at the other end, it's also hard to say no when we are asked to do something or to comply to certain requests. And I'm thinking about there are like the obvious, like in my role, for example, I think about maybe in a sales conversation, you are being pitched, and even if you know that that's not the right thing for you, you don't want to do it, you find it sometimes some people may find it hard to say no. It's not just in a professional context. I think in your book, if I remember well, you also give an example of romantic advances, for example. Again, it's hard to say no, and so we end up saying yes to things that we shouldn't. And so, why is that? Again, what's going on there? Why do we find it hard to say no?
Yeah, so, when someone asks us for something, saying no is like not cooperating, right? So you've kind of held out your hand, you've asked for my help in some way, or you've asked me to do something, together. And the no is essentially like, I'm going to break down this opportunity to cooperate. And so I sort of frame it that way because there's a lot of work showing that we're evolutionarily wired to cooperate, right? Our cooperation in groups and sort of our social nature as humans is what made us as successful as we are as a species. And so when we're wired to cooperate, we worry that we might be punished by the group if we don't cooperate, right? That we'll get a bad reputation or that, this person won't want to help us in the future. But we also just have these really strong emotions because of that, because evolutionarily, we've sort of developed these strong moral emotions like guilt, like embarrassment, like awkwardness. And so in that moment, saying no kind of brings to the fore all those emotions. Like we feel really bad to do this. We don't want to offend the other person. We don't want to seem like an uncooperative person. We don't want to damage the relationship. We don't want to have these negative repercussions down the line potentially, and be punished in terms of our reputation or future reciprocity. So saying no is just very fraught at the end of the day. Like that's all that stuff combines to make it really fraught. And so one example, one sort of illustration of that is if you imagine, so there's research showing essentially like that when we are mindlessly deciding how to respond to a request, that our default is to say yes. So there's this classic research that came out of a professor named Ellen Langer at Harvard, where she had her research assistants asked to cut in front of people in line. And when they said, I need to may I please cut in front of you in line? I need to make some copies. This was in line for a copier. Over 90% of people just let them in and let them cut. All right. And so you think about like that default, like we just say yes. And some people will say things like, no is a complete sentence, right? A lot of the time there's like this, it's supposed to be empowering to think of no as a complete sentence. But I really think that illustration, and if you imagine yourself and someone cutting in front of you in line, like yes is a complete sentence, right? When someone asks to cut in front of you in line, you're like, okay, sure, yes, and there's nothing more to say. But if you're going to say no to someone, all of a sudden that you come up with all sorts of excuses and reasons. It takes that much more effort, right? So if someone's going to ask to cut in front of you in line, it's usually not just no. It's like, no, sorry, I'm also in a rush. You don't say like, yes, I'm doing this because of this, it takes this added justification. So you really kind of, if you think about the effort that it takes to say yes versus no, no is really the more effortful, fraught kind of answer.
And talking about giving no as an answer, we have our mutual friend Vanessa Patrick. She was on the podcast, and that's what we talked about, how to use the answer no, how to say no effectively. And it's not easy, you're right. Now, Vanessa, going back to some of the psychological biases, there's another one where you say that people think about what we say more than we think.
Yeah. So this is a recent bias that's been discovered by Erica Boothby and Gus Cooney. And they've basically shown that, if you are sort of having a conversation with another person and, talking about whatever, and you walk away from that conversation and you ask the two people after the fact how much they're thinking about what the other person said and how much they think the other person is thinking about things that they said, right? There's this disconnect. So we assume that we walk away and people are kind of on to the next, have forgotten the things we say. But in fact, people report kind of reflecting on the things that were said in that conversation much more than we expect. And so on the one hand, I think that can make you kind of paranoid because we often also walk away from conversations thinking, oh God, I can't believe I said that. I put my foot in my mouth. I wish I had said something different. But there's also this additional effect, right, of the liking gap, where not only are people thinking about you more after the fact, after having an interaction, but they also report liking you more in that interaction and finding you more interesting than we tend to think. So that extra time that people are spending thinking about you and what you said in that conversation is more often in a positive light than the sort of like negative light that we worry about.
And that's exactly why I said that your book made me happy because, again, another bias, which is very much connected to what you said, was about the first impressions. Often we make a better first impression than we think.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a lot of psychological biases that are kind of along these lines where actually they're a more optimistic interpretation of kind of the way that we beat ourselves up, basically. So we make more positive first impressions than we think, and that's in part due to the liking gap. There's also the spotlight effect, which is kind of related to this as well. So the spotlight effect is this idea that we are so focused on whatever we're self-conscious about. So whether it's like something about our physical appearance or, some, gaffe we made in an interaction, we're so focused on that we think everybody else is as well. But in fact, people are less likely to notice those embarrassing things than we imagine. And so that finding is in part the result of this classic study that was done by one of my colleagues here at Cornell, Tom Gilovich, where they had participants wear embarrassing t-shirts. So at the time, it was embarrassing to wear like a Barry Manilow t-shirt. And so they brought participants into the lab. They were like, hey, put this Barry Manilow t-shirt on, and now I'm going to lead you in front of a bunch of other participants. And then, oh, I got to take you out of that room now. And they would ask people who were like embarrassed to be seen in this t-shirt, how much do you think everyone else in that room noticed your t-shirt? And they overestimated by about twice as much how much other people were noticing this thing that they were acutely embarrassed about. So again, we're kind of noticing people in this broader, more positive lens than we tend to realize when we're really worried about the impression that we're making.
And I love this. This is great. Also, I'm thinking about the implications in our world. Our world, Vanessa, is around public speaking, presenting, and so often as speakers, we worry so much about us. We think that the audience is judging us, the speaker, whereas that's not the case. We need to learn to get over ourselves. It's never about us. It's always about the audience and our content, of course, and how our content can help the audience. So there are lots of everything you said. There are lots of implications for public speaking as well. And so what we are saying here is that often the experience in our head is different from reality. And again, is there anything else here to add? Why is it? Thinking about your research, why is it that often the experience in our head is different from reality?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And that I think that's exactly what it is. It's that, our subjective experience of how people are sort of viewing us and how much we're impacting other people is very different from reality. And that was actually the way I first got into this. So just to backtrack for a moment. So I this sort of my first entrance into even studying this came from running studies back as a graduate student and collecting data in Penn Station in New York City. So basically, I was running studies with a professor of mine at the time. And I had to go down to Penn Station to get sort of a representative sample of just, all ages and races. And so I would go down with my little bundle of questionnaires and go up to people and say, like, will you fill out this questionnaire? And after I'd done this for about a week and found it incredibly painful and awful to have to ask people for things, I brought the data back up to campus at Columbia, where I was a grad student. We analyzed it, and lo and behold, we found that whatever prediction we had made for that particular study didn't work. And so this is a pretty typical thing, like, oh, our study didn't work. Let's try to debrief and just see what was going on. But what happened is, as Frank Flynn, who was the professor I was working with, was kind of looking at my spreadsheet of data where I had recorded what people said to me and whether they agreed to help me out and, any kind of excuses they made if they said no. I was kind of pacing around the room saying, like, oh my God, I can't believe this didn't work. That was so painful. That was horrible. I can never do that again. And Frank and I there was this light bulb moment where he was like, I'm hearing you describe the subjective experience of just like this awful, painful, terrible thing. And I'm looking at the objective data in front of my face, and people are being really nice to you. They're saying, when they're saying no, they're saying it in a very nice way. They're saying yes more than you're kind of describing. And so that was exactly the beginning of this was like, whatever I was describing, whatever I was seeing was very different from reality. And so you asked, why is that? And so there's a lot of reasons going on there. A huge one is that a lot of the influence we have, we just don't see. And so when you think about like how would you judge if you actually had a positive influence on somebody else, if you actually got someone to like change their opinion or think differently or whatever it is you're trying to do? Really, the only way you could be super sure is in the moment you make a case to someone and they say to your face, like, you changed my opinion. I think differently now. Right. And I mean, how often does that ever happen? And so we think, like, oh my gosh, it's so hard to change people's opinions. But the way influence actually works is that people don't suddenly change their mind in that moment. They think about what we said later, as we talked about, more than we tend to think, right? So they continue to ponder something that we said. Maybe they don't buy it right away, but they start coming around a week later. Or it accumulates with what other people say. So they hear us say something, they hear something similar a week later, and it compounds. And now you're like, oh, maybe I do kind of agree with, what was said earlier. And so a lot of the things that are going on that constitute influence aren't things that you're going to pick up on. And so because of that, you're going to assume I didn't have any impact on this person. But in fact, like the wheels are turning and you could very well have had a big impact.
Before we continue with this episode, I just want to share a few resources that I think will be super useful for you. The first one is check out either my book, Confident Presenter, or my colleague Phil Wakenow's book, Business Presentation Revolution, or both. These are books for business owners and leaders who want to take their presentation skills to a higher level. To make the most of the books, take the Confident Presenter Scorecard, which is an online tool that allows you to assess your presentation skills for free in less than 3 minutes. And then also, at the moment, I'm running a series of free presentation skills web classes, and I'd love to see you there. The links are in the show notes. Now, let's go back to the episode. Now, an important question for me at this point is this. Now that we know that we have more influence than we think, For me, that's good news. At the same time, also because I'm thinking about what you said before, that we also find it hard to say no to things, to requests. Then if of course, I want to be influential. I want to be able to influence and persuade people. I want them to do something. Again, thinking about my business background, for example. At the same time, I don't want to make requests in a way that's pushy. So, is there something here to say, thinking about your work? How do we go about, yes, using our influence and persuasion, but without making requests that feel pushy.
Yeah, I think this is such an important question. And one of the things I sort of avoided using in the book, but like to sort of talk about is the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. Because it is true that with this influence that we have a certain responsibility to make sure we're using it in a positive way, right? And part of that is not putting pressure on people to do things that they're really uncomfortable doing and trying to sort of be aware of that. And so, I've spent a lot of time sort of thinking about how to manage these two competing goals, right? So we don't want to just throw our hands up and say, well, I'll never ask for anything, because I don't want to pressure anyone, I don't want to impose. Because there's plenty of times where there's actually an integrative solution where actually both people would be better off if you asked, and the person would be happy to help, right? At the same time, it can be problematic for both people if you're basically coercing someone to agree to something. So even, it could be that you're getting them to do something that's very uncomfortable and unethical, et cetera. And so that's, its own domain of thinking about, is this an okay thing to ask? But even for things that, are fine to ask, it could be that someone feels pressured to agree, and then down the line they, bail. Like they agree to give a talk, and then at the last minute they say that they can't do it because they didn't really want to do it, or they do less of a good job. So it's really to everyone's benefit to ask for things in ways that both give you the chance to genuinely ask for the thing that you want and also give the other person a chance to say no. And so to kind of do that, I have to take like two halves of my research. So some of my research looks at how you get people to be more likely to say yes. And some of those things are like asking in person, right? In part because it's hard to say no when someone's standing there in front of you and you have to say no to their face. Asking directly. So coming out and actually asking for something. So people generally don't realize that you have to actually directly ask for something to get it. So we do things like beat around the bush, like I could really use some help with this. It'd be great if you could do this. And we think that that's just as good as saying, could you do this? Will you help me with this? But it really isn't, right? So it's that direct request that gets people to think, okay, now I need to come up with an answer. But it can also put someone on the spot, right? So when I'm telling people sort of how to get people to say yes, it's like ask in person, ask directly, things like that. On the flip side, those are the contexts that make it harder to say no. So when I'm talking to people about how to make requests that are less coercive to make sure you're getting a genuine, enthusiastic yes, it's like, well, maybe don't ask face to face, or at least give them time to respond by email or not in person. Um, ask in a way that gives them the words to say no. And so what I try to do is basically combine those two things. So if I, for example, one scenario where I might ask for something, but also really want the other person to genuinely buy in is if I have an idea for a research project for a graduate student. So I may have a really good idea that I think this graduate student should work on this research project. I think it'd be good for them. I think I would like them to do it. And so what I'll do is in an in-person meeting, I will make my pitch for why I think this is a good idea. And I will say, I'd love for you to work on this. So would you be willing to work on this? Right. So I'm making my pitch. I'm making it clear that I am actually asking you to do this, But then I will say, but I don't, if you don't have time to do this, if you feel like it's too much, if you're not excited about it, because someone really, if you're going to work on research, you have to be excited for a long period of time. It could take years to do a research project. And I don't want someone who just does it because they felt like they couldn't say no to me because I was their advisor. And so I'll say, take some time to think about it and then get back to me either in our next meeting or send me an email because then they don't actually have to say to my face, I really didn't think that was a great idea or I'm really not that into that idea. Come up with the words that you feel comfortable with, saying no through an email, which allows you to kind of control exactly what's being said. And so that I try to sort of mix the two, give my best pitch so that I give myself a chance to like ask for this thing in a genuine way that might be beneficial for everybody, but also give them as much freedom as possible to say no because I really want them to genuinely commit if they're going to do that.
And this is very coherent with what Vanessa Patrick told us in the conversation on how to say no. For example, one of the things I remember she said was because again, from her perspective, with that book, the power of saying no, we were talking about, okay, it's how we find it hard sometimes to say no. So how can we do that? How can we avoid that? She said one of the things you want to do is try as much as possible to avoid situations where you are in person, precisely because of what you said, because it's harder to say no when you are in person. Now, do you have you mentioned, and I found that interesting also in your book, you said that in person, face to face, it's harder, it's easier to influence people, to get people to do what you want. What's the data there? Is there specific data, like the difference between asking for things in person versus online?
Yeah, so actually, we've done a number of studies on this. So we've had people, I mentioned like my initial studies were having people come into the lab, go out into the world, ask people for things in person, right? And since then, we've done a number of studies comparing that same paradigm. So we have one group of people do it that way to people who come into the lab and send an email to people asking for the same thing or they do a Zoom call and ask for the same thing, or they do a phone call and ask for the same thing. And so we've compared people's estimates of how effective each of the asking through each of those media will be, and then we look at how actually effective it is. And so what we find is a pretty clear sort of increasing effectiveness as you get to face. So email is the absolute least effective. So in our studies, when we compare email to face to face is 34 times more effective than email. But then the question is, what's everything in between? And so we find that when you go from email to phone and video calls, that it's much more effective over phone and video calls than email, but then it still isn't as effective as in person. And so we wanted to sort of see like what are all these elements. So if you think about the differences between these different media, right? You've got how synchronous it is. So is this in real time? So email is not a real time medium. Phone and Zoom calls are in real time, right? We also wondered about being sort of saying no to someone's face and sort of the additional sort of expressions that you get when you're looking at someone over video versus over the phone. And we don't really find a big difference there. So it seems like the real-time interaction is important, some sort of humanizing element, like a voice, but it doesn't have to be a video call. So like a phone call was just as useful. But still, there's something about being in the physical space of somebody else that is fundamentally different. And in part, so one of our reasons for this is something called media naturalness theory. And it's basically this idea that we evolved, going back to sort of evolutionary psychology again, but we evolved to interact with other people in real space in small groups, right? And so each step that we get away from that, those people just aren't as important to us anymore in terms of like, that person can't hurt me. I can't mate with that person, right? All these basic sort of evolutionary things. Like it's just that person is not as important to me in this immediate moment. If I can't like reach out and touch them essentially. So yeah, so we find that this in person is just there is just a step above anything else. And the what I think is also the most interesting piece of all this is that when we asked people, how effective do you think you'll be in this medium? Effective do you think you'll be in this medium? There was no difference. So people really felt like when I ask someone for something, they're going to decide whether they want to do it based on them, based on, whether they want to commit to the time to this, how they feel about me, like whatever that sort of decision exists in them. But in fact, we find that it really, really is impacted by how it's asked.
Understood. And I want to make sure that I got it right because also this is important for some of my own activities. So did I understand well that okay, we've got emails, we've got face to face, and then in between we've got phone calls or video calls. You said that the data suggests that there are not meaningful differences between phone calls when we are not on video and video calls. Is that correct?
That's what we found in our data. And it's possible that there'll be situations where it does matter more. But yeah, we found no differences in actual effectiveness of phone or video call. And there's other research as well showing that just the humanizing sound of a voice is enough to sort of make you feel the same feelings you would get of like a video call. So it does seem like you don't always, and I like this because I mean, people get Zoom fatigue, right? And so I try to like have some phone calls in there as well to like give myself a break. And I feel like you still get a lot of what you would get over Zoom. Like you still get a lot of that sort of humanizing stuff going on.
That's what I was asking. So that's good to know. Interesting. And what about offering money in exchange for compliance? So again, we want someone or a group of people to ideally do something. Of course, always in the spirit of this is win-win. So it can benefit both parties. Anything from your research, anything connected to offering money in exchange for requests?
Yeah, this was a project that I did a while back where we, again, used a similar paradigm. We had a group of people just go and ask strangers for things. And then we had another group of people that we actually gave money to offer in exchange for compliance for things. So we did this with completing just a survey. So very similar to our original studies. So half of the people that went out and asked strangers to complete a survey were just asked, will you please fill out the survey? So it's just like a request, basically a favor. The other half said, can I give you $1 to fill out the survey? And so they would go out and actually and they held the dollar in their hand. So it was clear like this was an exchange. And what we found was that the askers, right, the people who were trying to influence these people to fill out the survey, thought the dollar was going to make a huge difference. So they thought that there would be a big increase in compliance if they offered money in exchange for compliance. But when they actually kept track of how many people agreed to the request in both conditions, there was no difference. So people were agreeing at the same rate for nothing as they were for money.
Could it be though, and I'm just thinking out loud here, Vanessa, could it be that okay, that was the case? I could argue that that was the case because we are talking about $1. If it was $100, maybe it was different, or maybe not. What do you think?
I definitely think that if you had a higher incentive could potentially make a difference. The big things in this study, why that probably wouldn't explain these findings, although again, I think in other contexts that surely would make a difference, is that the movement of actual compliance, so the actual number of people agreeing it was really that the $1 was the same as the people who were just agreeing sort of naturally. It was I guess another way to put it is that it seems like what's going on is that people are sort of agreeing to be helpful, right? And that like offering $1, like people would even refuse it. Like when you're asked for something, you're like, well, I'll do this as a favor. Like I don't need the incentive, right? So it's not that in those cases more of incentive would get more people to comply necessarily. It was just like thinking of this interaction more as like I'm helping somebody out, right? As opposed to like I'm not getting anything out of this. The other piece that I think is important to sort of note about that study is that even if a bigger incentive would have changed actual compliance, part of the conclusion, right, is that the people asking thought the dollar was going to make a big difference, right? So they felt like this was enough to make a big difference. And one of the ways we explain that is similar to what I was just saying, where they thought of this as more of an economic exchange, right? So if I have nothing to offer, I'm asking you for a favor. And so it becomes a favor exchange. If I'm offering you a dollar, it becomes a like transaction, right? And transactions are less fraught. I'm offering to pay you for something. I'm offering to hire you essentially. And so it made people feel a lot more comfortable asking, even though it doesn't seem to have made any difference, at least in our study, in terms of actual compliance.
Makes sense. And what about cultural differences? In your work, have you found any, again, if we think about everything we talked about, influencing people, persuading them to do something, have you found any differences from a cultural perspective?
Yeah, so we've run our studies in a few different countries now, kind of trying to see how generalizable these effects are. Um, the biggest sort of the sort of biggest cultural shift that we explored was between the US, so comparing this same sort of study where people guessed how likely people would be to agree to this request, like a typical survey request in New York City, to Beijing, China. And so we were really kind of curious whether this would be exacerbated in a more individualistic culture versus a more collectivistic culture. And so what we found was that when we ran this study in those two different cities, we both of them had big effects. So both of them underestimated how likely people would be to agree to do a simple sort of favor, like a survey, fill out a survey for someone. So we did find that it generalized to another culture. That said, there were some differences. And so it wasn't quite as strong in China as it was in the United States. And so part of that was that people in China were more likely to say yes. So you would sort of expect that for a more collectivistic culture, that there's kind of more of a sense of obligation to one another. I'll help you out if you ask for something. So they were a little bit more likely to say yes. And they were also a little bit more accurate. So they guessed that people would say yes a little bit more than in the American sample, which again is kind of an awareness of cultural norms that like, yeah, if I ask for something, people culturally are sort of obligated to agree to that. One thing that comes out with these cultural differences is people have described people who are asking for something in more collectivistic cultures as being more aware of the fact that the other person is going to feel obligated to say yes. And so there's more of an onus on the asker to make sure that what they're asking for is acceptable, right? So there's kind of like, I assume that this will put a little pressure on you. I assume that because we have this collectivistic way of being, like you're going to feel obligated to help me out. And so I need to think twice about whether me asking you for this is really worth your time. Whereas the more sort of individualistic approach is like, if you don't want to do it, just say no, right? Like, you're not going to do something you don't really want to do. Now, I have argued that that is not true. Like, even in individualistic cultures like the US, people do feel obligated to do things, right? And it's more of a kind of fantasy that people will just say no if they don't want to do something, and that we should kind of take on that way of thinking about asking for things of like, assume someone will say yes, and then ask yourself, should you be asking for this? Are you asking for the right thing? Maybe you should ask for more in some cases, but maybe you shouldn't ask at all in sort of other cases. So it's interesting to compare the cultures and kind of think about like which parts you might want to borrow in more individualistic cultures.
Yeah, and that's a helpful thought to have, a reminder. Assume, you just said assume that they will say yes, and then of course we can consider the other important things to keep in mind. But let's assume that they will say yes. That's a helpful way of thinking. And Vanessa, in addition to your book, which I highly recommend, You Have More Influence Than You Think, and we are going to include in the show notes. And one of the reasons why I recommend it is because it's not just your opinion, it's based on social science and research and data, and I very much like this approach. And we also mentioned a few other books like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Robert Cialdini, Influence, Daniel Pink, To Sell is Human. Is there anything else? Are there any other books that you would recommend to our listeners if they want to explore this subject, influence, persuasion, in a little bit more detail?
Well, I definitely, we've mentioned a couple times Vanessa Patrick's Power of No, which is great. I really, so, most of your listeners probably don't need to be told to read Adam Grant, but I think that his more recent work has been, more popular. I am a huge fan of Give and Take, his first book. So if, people have kind of come late to Adam Grant and haven't read his first book, that one really talks about a lot of these dynamics, about asking for things and, being like sort of a giver or a taker or sort of a matcher. Um, Along those lines, there's also a book by Heidi Grant that people might not be aware of called Reinforcements, How to Get People to Help You. And it's all about asking. It talks a lot about my own research. It talks about Adam Grant's work on that topic. But it really, if you're interested in primarily on sort of asking and how to get better at asking for things, that's a really great one.
And that's great. Thank you very much. We're going to include those two books and authors in the show notes. And out of curiosity, Vanessa, if you think about your own book, of course, now it's out and it's there. If you had an opportunity to go back to it and change something or make some edits, would you change anything? And if so, what? The answer could be no. I'm just curious.
That's a really great question. Ah, I'm not sure I'm sure that I would go back and change things. I'm one of those people, I definitely would never think it's perfect done. Um, I think so. I get asked a lot, and I think this is I'm like, what would I kind of, one of the ways to think about it for me is like, what do I get asked all the time that I wish I had sort of preempted an answer to? And I get asked a lot about age differences. So I talk about race and I talk about gender in the book and sort of how those can affect our sort of impressions of our own influence as well as our actual influence. But I really don't talk about age. And there's some really interesting work out there that I could have talked about on age. So, for example, there's some work that fits really nicely with the message of the book, showing that we assume that older people don't want our advice as much as younger people, and that assumption is incorrect. And so, like, if I'm, so they talk about it sort of in terms of age, but also status and things like that. So if I'm, a sort of young person in my job, I look to the younger people to give my advice to. And like if someone older than me or in a higher rank than me is kind of seeking advice, I just kind of assume like, oh, they don't want it from me. But in fact, if you're one of those people who is older in the workplace or has been there for a long time, like all you want is advice from younger people. You're like, tell me what's going on the ground. Tell me, what the new trends are. Tell me, how your interpretation and your generation's interpretation of this is. But we tend to underestimate that when we are younger. And so I definitely would have included some of that because a lot of people have told me, I don't think this would work for like older people, or I don't think, there's a lot of intuitions about age that I would have gotten into.
Age, that's you just gave us another example that illustrates that often the experience in our head is different from reality. And because you mentioned gender, and I
Mhm.
forgot to ask you again, for those who haven't read the book, what do we need to know about gender in the context of our conversation?
Yeah, so gender is really interesting. So, on the one hand, women tend to be socialized to be more communal and cooperative than men. And so, we talked earlier about how one of the things that makes it difficult to say no is this idea that, oh, I'm being uncooperative. So there is a gender element to that, that women sometimes find it more difficult to say no because we could be labeled as uncooperative, and that's kind of even more damaging for women based on cultural stereotypes than for men. On the other hand, too, women tend to hold back from asking for things. And this is, this is a finding that has kind of, it was found years ago, this classic book, Women Don't Ask. And so the idea was that, we could explain a lot of the sort of societal ills, like the gender wage gap, based on this idea that like women just aren't asking for raises and men are asking, and like that can explain it away. It turns out that that message really got out. And now, if you look at like salary negotiations, women do ask just as much as men. So that kind of gap has gone away, but the gender wage gap has not gone away. So that wasn't sort of the main explanation. That said, there's a lot of other situations where women don't ask. So there's some research showing that women are less likely to ask for an extension, like a deadline extension, than men. It's this worry again about like being uncooperative. Like, I don't want to hold other people up. I feel like I'd be imposing on somebody else. But in fact, they aren't judged any more harshly than men when they do ask for a deadline extension. So there's a lot of ways in which gender and mostly sort of the way that we're socialized as women to be cooperative, and that means like not asking for things that, make us seem like we're being difficult, and not saying no to things that make us seem like we're being difficult, that are important to sort of be aware of.
All these things, Vanessa, for me are super interesting, fascinating, the human behavior. So I could spend hours here having a conversation with you, but I don't want to take too much of your time. If someone wants to connect with you, they want to say hi, they want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
Sure. They can, I have my website, vanessabohns.com, with all my contact information there. I'm on X, formerly Twitter, at Prof Bonds. I'm on Instagram at Prof Bonds, and I'm on LinkedIn. So you can find me at any of those places.
Okay, perfect. Again, we're going to include everything in the show notes. Last question, Vanessa. If you think about everything we talked about, and if you think about your work, your book, what's the most important thing? Let's say that someone watches these, that they listen to this conversation, and then after a while they forget everything, and it's not your fault, it's just the way our brain works. But let's say that they remember just one thing. And if they remember that thing, you will be happy. What's the most important thing you would like your readers or listeners to take away from your work, from your book?
So this does go back to something that you pointed out as well, right? So one of my favorite takeaways from the whole book that I think is sort of a nugget that can uh, be sort of drawn out to represent the book as a whole is assume if you ask for something, you're going to get a yes. Because if you just start from there, you can start thinking about, what you should be asking for, whether you should be asking for more, as we talked about earlier, whether you shouldn't be asking for this at all, whether you should be asking for this in a different way, right? Giving someone the ability to say no to you. And I think just that idea that, like, when you ask for things, people's default is to agree to you, right? Not to disagree. That's sort of the fundamental takeaway, because that's true in all sorts of other contexts as well. Like when you make a point, people are trying to understand your point. They're not trying to jump down your throat the way we tend to expect. People, when they meet you, they like you more than you tend to think, right? They want to like you. So just this general idea of like people's default is to agree, is to cooperate, is to be influenced by you, I think is a really helpful way to sort of go through the world. And it means that we won't be scared to use our influence and ask for things, but at the same time, it means that we'll strike the right tone. We won't try to push people harder than we need to because we assume like this message will be received, right?
Again, I love this. This is not only helpful, it's also reassuring. I told you at the very beginning of this conversation that your book made me happy. Also, this conversation made me happy. Again, your ideas are very reassuring. That's great. That's good to know. And Vanessa, thank you. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.